I came across a Craigslist listing for a stunning antique piano at an amazing price. I'd been looking for one for quite some time, and these types of pianos may be prohibitively pricey if the seller is aware of their true worth. I emailed the vendor, and he promptly responded. He appeared polite and pleased to meet me and show me the piano. I didn't think much of the address he gave me because it was a little off the main road in a rural region outside of town. Thursday evening, precisely on time, I hopped in my car and drove out there. It was already dark, and the curving roads were becoming increasingly dangerous as I traveled. I was becoming increasingly concerned. When I arrived at the place he had given me, it appeared to be an old church. I think I didn't understand the distinction between an old farmhouse and an old church, though they all looked the same to me, so I assumed that was what it was. I noticed the man walking out the front door, waving and screaming my name. I stepped out of my car hesitantly and started walking closer to him. He was tall and slim, with dull beady eyes and a peculiar smile. He appeared friendly, yet something was odd about him. "Thank you for coming," he said. "I hope the trip wasn't too long." I nodded, attempting to calm myself and drive away the unsettling feelings. He brought me inside, which I instantly recognized as an old church that had been transformed into some sort of temporary musical instrument museum. The walls were lined with drums, banjos, guitars, and a variety of other instruments, but I didn't notice the piano. I turned around and inquired where the piano was. "Downstairs," he answered. I paused. Something was not quite right about the way he stated it. Nonetheless, I followed him down a short corridor to a stairway down below. Before walking down the stairs, he took a large flashlight. As we neared the bottom, he turned to me and smiled lopsidedly. "Don't worry, it's down here." He used the flashlight to illuminate a little chamber off to the side. I paused, questioning whether I should walk in, but I was too far in to turn back now. We walked into the room. The man turned on the lights, which were just dim enough to view the piano in the center. The problem was that it didn't resemble the image in the advertisement. The wood was flaking, keys were missing from one end of the keyboard, and it was much smaller than I expected. Quite what I was anticipating. I responded politely, but my disappointment was apparent in my voice. "I'm sorry, it's not quite what you were searching for," he said. He leaned against the wall, arms folded, watching my every move. I felt imprisoned, self-conscious, and panicked. The entire setup was strange, and I felt compelled to leave. "Thank you for doing this, but I guess I'll pass on it," I responded. I turned to face the man, who was still leaning against the wall and smiling crookedly. "Is there anything else you want to look at?" he inquired. "No, I'm fine," I mumbled, frightened by his tone. "I believe that's it for today." I hurried out of the room and down the dark, unlit corridor. I found the stairs and swiftly made my way up, leaving the front door open. Even though I had escaped, I couldn't shake the impression that something evil was going on. Perhaps it was the way John looked at me, or the way he acted, or the tone in his voice. When I came home, I opened my laptop and went online to check the location. It displayed a photograph of the old church, which was designated as a historical music museum open only on weekends for viewings. I looked into it further and found no evidence of them selling anything. My whole body shook, and I shut down my laptop. I'd most certainly escaped something terrible. I was already skeptical of sites like Craigslist, but that was it. I haven't utilized Craigslist or even Facebook Marketplace since that night, because it's a gamble with your life over some used stuff. Don't use Craigslist, and if you do, have your guard up at all times. That encounter left an indelible impression on me. It served as a sharp warning of the risks lying beneath seemingly innocuous online transactions. I realized how quickly I had let my guard down, swept up in the thrill of finding a good deal. The entire situation made me reconsider my approach to purchasing items from strangers on the internet. The encounter tormented me as the days grew into weeks. I couldn't get rid of the uneasy sense that I had narrowly avoided a deadly situation. What if I'd been more gullible? What if the man's intentions were different? These questions ran through my head, emphasizing the lessons I'd learned. It wasn't simply the physical danger. It was also the psychological toll. The fear of being vulnerable that comes with understanding you're in an unfamiliar environment with a stranger can be debilitating. When you're focused on a purported bargain, it's easy to underestimate the significance of intuition and gut instincts. I became more cautious after that. I began learning more about secure internet purchasing and selling procedures. I read about other people's experiences with scams, frauds, and sometimes dangerous circumstances. Meeting in public settings during daytime hours, bringing a buddy, and trusting my intuition were all crucial measures in ensuring my safety. I gradually began to tell my tale to friends and relatives. I wanted to raise awareness about the potential dangers of online transactions. I advised them to be cautious, prioritize their safety, and never ignore their instincts. The event also inspired me to look into alternative methods of purchasing and selling products. I resorted to respected internet marketplaces with stronger security precautions. When it came to larger purchases, such as musical instruments, I opted to stick with well-known stores and dealers, even if it meant paying a bit more. That strange incident became a cautionary story in my circle as the years passed. My pals would exchange knowing glances and ask, "Have you heard the piano story?" Whenever someone discussed making a transaction using internet platforms, it had become a community lesson in the significance of being cautious, even in the digital era. That bizarre experience, in retrospect, served as a wake-up call. It reminded me that, while the internet offers convenience and access to limitless options, it also has perils that should not be overlooked. I learned to follow my instincts, conduct thorough research, and put my safety above the appeal of a good offer. So, the next time you're enticed by an unbelievable deal online, remember the piano story. It's all right to say no, to walk away, and to prioritize your well-being. After all, your safety is priceless, and no deal is worth jeopardizing it. Having recently relocated to a new location, I turned to Craigslist to find a roommate for my new apartment. I emailed him as soon as I saw his message. James was his name. We exchanged a few emails and phone calls, and everything appeared to be fine. We decided to meet in person a few days later to go through the details. At first glance, James appeared to be a kind and easygoing individual. He was in his early 30s and reminded me of myself. We talked about our interests and hobbies for a bit, and he told me some amusing stories about his former housemates. James became quite solemn as we were winding off our talk. "I have something I need to tell you. It's quite significant," he stated. "I have a problem that causes some individuals discomfort." I looked at him, perplexed. "Under what circumstances?" "It's called sleepwalking," he explained. "I just wanted you to know in case there was a problem." I shrugged and said it was okay, nothing to worry about. The initial weeks passed without incident. We got along well, and James seemed like a fantastic roommate. But then I started noticing unusual things in the mornings around the flat. Food would be missing from the refrigerator, and items would be rearranged. I assumed that was just James's sleepwalking and didn't think much about it. I was startled one night by an odd noise emanating from James's chamber. I thought he was talking to himself at first, but then I realized it was something else. A deep, growling sound that sent shivers down my spine. I gently rose, crept to his door, and listened. The snarling became more violent and louder. I carefully opened the door and glanced inside. I noticed James standing in the center of the room with his eyes closed. It was an odd and unnerving sight. I felt like I was seeing something I shouldn't have been seeing and chose to back away and return to my room. The sounds continued for a few minutes before stopping. I avoided saying anything to James in the morning so as not to embarrass him. He seemed to be acting normally in any case, so I put it all aside and forgot about it. After a few days, I began to wake up to footsteps in the corridors, doors opening and closing, and sometimes even James making that same growling type sound. I knew it was only James's sleepwalking, so it didn't scare me, but I couldn't sleep unless I heard him go back to bed. But one night, I awoke to the sound of James' bedroom door closing. He always closes the door quietly, but it sounded like he slammed it this time. My eyes sprung open, and I gazed at my door as his footsteps moved over and came to a halt. His shadow could be seen beneath the break in the door. The doorknob gently turned, and he softly opened the door. James stood in the shadows between the doorways. I was caught in place, staring at my frightening roommate. Even though I knew he was sleepwalking, it was still a scary sight. Then he started making the same growling sounds. He came to a halt after a brief moment. A few seconds later, his eyes sprang wide, and he pounced at me. He had me pinned down in seconds. His eyes were expressionless and emotionless. "Stay still," he murmured monotonously as if he was still sleeping. "You must not move." I tried to get away, but he was too powerful. I felt a deep, overwhelming terror well up inside of me. And then it was over, just like that. James let go of me and slumped off the bed, then walked back to his room, softly closing his door behind him. I instantly got up and shut my bedroom door, then stayed awake all night. I departed for work before James had even gotten out of bed. I hated seeing him at home after work because I knew I'd make things unpleasant. But when I pulled into the driveway, his car was nowhere to be found. I soon observed that several things were missing from the house, and when I went to check on his room, it had been empty. I tried phoning James several times over the next 2 days, but received no response. I never heard anything else from him. I'm not sure why he departed. Perhaps he was aware of what he had done and felt ashamed. But if he was sleepwalking, he wouldn't have remembered anything. It still frightens me. And because my mind associates the event with Craigslist, I stopped using the site. I only hope James was truly sleepwalking, because if he wasn't, I'm afraid he'll return. I had always enjoyed exploring Craigslist for bargains and finding unique stuff that I couldn't find anywhere else. I came across an ad for a vintage record player in excellent shape one day. I couldn't stop myself from emailing the vendor to inquire about it. Surprisingly, the seller responded within minutes, and we quickly began discussing the item's specifics. The vendor, named Jack, was friendly and ready to make the sale. We planned to meet at his place later that week to finalize the transaction. I arrived at the apartment complex on time and went straight to Jack's unit. I could tell there was something odd about the apartment as soon as I walked in, but I couldn't quite put my finger on it. I thought Jack had a weird energy about him as he welcomed me in. He was jittery and appeared tense, but I dismissed it as him being anxious. I examined the record player and was thrilled to discover that it was in much better shape than the photographs suggested. I was about to make the purchase when Jack interrupted me and asked if I wanted to see something extremely cool he had in the other room. Despite my reservations, I consented to follow him. We made our way to the apartment's back area. The area was filled with a slew of objects and items that appeared to be completely random. Jack pointed to a large trunk in the corner of the room and said he had something I'd be interested in inside. As he opened the trunk, I was assaulted with a musty odor that made me dizzy. An old ripped white sheet was found inside the trunk. I could tell there was something beneath it, but I didn't want to see what it was. "Sorry, the stench is just too much," I replied as I turned to walk back to the other room. He stayed beside the trunk, still calling me back for a quick look, assuring me I wouldn't be sorry. I was too shaken by the unusual sensations to stay. I ignored him and exited the apartment complex through his door. I was still dizzy and seemed to be growing dizzier by the minute. I stumbled as fast as my feet could take me to my car. I jumped in and drove for about 20 seconds, barely making it out of the parking lot before pulling to the side. I felt like I was going to pass out, and I must have since I awoke a few minutes later. I was sleepy and lightheaded, but I managed to drive further down the road and into a neighborhood, where I pulled over and went out uncontrollably. This phase was more difficult for me to recall, but when I awoke, it was darker outside, and my mind was cloudy and unclear. Everything was a muddle, and I couldn't make out structured thoughts. I managed to drive home, and as the night progressed, I gradually regained consciousness. I contacted the cops as soon as I could gather my thoughts. They were allowed into the flat, but Jack maintained He didn't have such a trunk, and they never discovered one. Nothing happened after that night, but I knew something wasn't right. Maybe I'm just paranoid, and the smell was simply a regular smell that freaked me out for some reason. But I'm quite convinced he had some kind of narcotic gas coming from the trunk, and if I had stayed any longer, I might not have made it out. The whole thing left me completely rattled. I couldn't get away from the impression that I had narrowly averted something evil. The unusual artifacts in Jack's apartment and his behavior seemed to corroborate that something was badly wrong. I found it difficult to shake the dread that had built within me as the days passed. I continued repeating the events in my head, attempting to make sense of it all. The scent, the ripped sheet, and Jack's continuous attempts to persuade me to look into the trunk were all very disturbing. I decided to do some research in the hopes of finding some answers, or at least knowledge that would help me understand what I had gone through. I heard stories about thieves utilizing various ways to incapacitate and rob victims. In certain situations, medications or gases were used to disorient or incapacitate unsuspecting victims. My anxiety began to lessen with time, though I remained cautious. That meeting stayed with me as a sharp reminder that the world might be a far darker place than we'd like to believe. It was a costly lesson, but it ultimately increased my awareness and intuition. So, if you ever find yourself in a position that raises red flags in your mind, don't be afraid to trust your instincts. It is preferable to be careful and maybe miss out on a bargain or opportunity than to put your safety in danger. My frightening experience taught me that lesson, and I hope that sharing my story will encourage others to be cautious as well.